So the next King story we're going to talk about is The End of the Whole Mess, which is the second story in Nightmares and Dreamscapes, and it's also from the series. And this is a really, I noticed just now doing this is kind of a weird story to talk about when you've literally just turned on a camera and sat down in front of it, because that's how this story starts, and it does not end well for the person in front of the camera. So, But the thing here is, this is actually, despite the fact that obviously, when it comes to the order in his short story collections, for the most part, it's sort of a random draw, the order in which they appear. And it's interesting that we start Nightmares and Dreamscapes, the book, with Dolan's Cadillac, which is, the revenge story that we'll talk about later. And then we go into this one, which goes into some pretty heavy subjects that are dealt with in pretty heavy ways. And it's also got a story of, like, brotherhood in the middle. Like, family in general, but brotherhood specifically at the middle of it also. And what's interesting about the way this story is told is that you can almost, because I think it's certainly one of the better episodes of the series, but it's also a really strong story also. And the thing is you could go into it poking fun at it pretty easily, because the whole point of the story is that it needs to be told urgently. But of course the thing is King has gotten a lot of criticism for both past and present for overwriting, as they call it, where he gets like really into the description of something or really into the backstory of something that may seem inconsequential. So thinking about King writing a story that is meant to be told with urgency, though you can still see some King isms in this. Like, he'll immediately say, I don't have much time, I don't have much time at all, this is a limited time, I have to get this story out right now. And then he'll go into a description of something that may or may not matter. But apart from that, or that could very well be tongue-in-cheek also, knowing King and his penchant for sort of intentional, almost parody of himself sometimes if he catches himself doing one of those things. But the thing about that is this, as far as the way the series tells the story, because obviously with the story we're told through text, but with here, with him being which is a character trait that carries over. He wants to be a documentary filmmaker and he has all these aspirations, so this is how he's going to tell this story. And I like the way that the episode actually tells it, almost like we're kind of cutting back and forth between actual flashbacks and these moments that look like a sort of amateur documentary. And obviously it's not to be taken, it's a really nice directorial choice, because obviously it's not meant to be taken literally, considering this is certainly not a documentary that will have post-production, given the outcome. But, and sometimes they throw in some weird moments there to bring that point across, like where Bobby comes out of the building he's just blown up, and when he falls over there's this weird cartoon sound effect. Whatever that was, but like I said, I assume it's to set up this sort of, it almost feels like we're watching if his documentary had been completed, or maybe it's a whole, somebody found the documentary and it's like a found footage thing. It could be any of those things, but that doesn't really matter as far as the length of the story goes. And of course I talked about the Brotherhood, so at the center of this is going to be two performances by Ron Livingston, who is our sort of narrator and storyteller, and Henry Thomas, who is the brother that's kind of the whole heart of the story and where it took off, and how it got into the direction that it did. And obviously there's definitely a sort of brotherhood between them, like as far as the performances go, that really comes through. Henry Thomas especially gets to really shine in a part like this. And of course this would certainly not be his last King outing, so it's nice to kind of see the early workings of that before he would go on to do the Mike Flanagan stuff. But another thing that this series does that really drives a point home with this story is the changing of current events. Obviously, we've moved up in the calendar a little bit, so and that's kind of the vibe you get anyway when you're reading it in the story, where it's like when he's saying, all the bad things that are happening in the world, and it's like it's something that's it's an unfortunately timeless story, because no matter how far up you go in the calendar, there's some big event or multiple big events you can fill that area with, that drive the character to make the decisions that they do and try what they do. And so I thought that was really, that just said something in itself, that they updated the events, for the story rather than setting them when the short story was at the time. So then, of course, there is some stuff, that really shines through in the story that we may not get in the series, like some dialogue, for instance. Obviously, TNT wouldn't allow. I always love the moment, just how absolutely blunt it is, because the whole thing is, the urgency of getting the story out, just the bluntness of the way he says it in the short story, where he says, Bobby said, help me, and so I helped him, and we fucked up. And it's just, the sentence is that simple, and sets up the whole tone for something went horribly wrong. And then it becomes almost apocalyptic, and even when you're watching the episode, it may almost give you vibes of what's happening currently. Once again, there's always the new current event that you can somehow put into this story. It's like this blank canvas almost. Which is terrifying, of course. So, because that's the thing, is you talk about how people tend to associate King strictly with horror, and as we've talked about with these, he's obviously done so many different things, but sometimes when it seems like he's doing something that's totally different from what he's typically known for, it can somehow find its way back around to being scary, just not necessarily in the traditional sense. So, as far as the like effects go, because we've talked about, especially we just talked about Crouch End and how the TV effects and the lack of practical effects can make things look a bit shitty, and the TV budget really starts to come through. You can tell they had to resort to CGI with this one in many cases, because this is a case where it's forgivable, because it's like with all the bees and the wasps, and it's like there would have been severe difficulties trying to tell the story with strictly practical effects. So, but thankfully, for the TV CGI, which usually looks like shit, the bees and the wasps actually look really good, and you can suspend disbelief enough to imagine that they're actually there. It's stuff. It's little weird details like the skipping the rock thing, where you can tell both the rock and the water is CGI, and that's off. But the stuff that's important, and I think that's probably why some of it looks shoddy and some of it looks great, is because they knew and they weighed like what's important to the story and what isn't. What do we really need to look good, and what can just be some effect or whatever. So I like that they were able to balance that enough to figure out what was important. And of course, you look at the turnout of the story, and just kind of talking about the story itself. And it's sort of the interesting take on it is that it's like the take he wanted to seemingly take was there. I can't read King's mind necessarily, just the stories, but what I took away from this myself was it's like simultaneously optimistic and pessimistic. Because obviously there's an optimism in, confronting, all the horrible shit that's happening, the big stuff and the small stuff, just kind of all at once. And the idea of living in a world where that just doesn't happen, like just stopping it altogether, as the title refers to. But obviously there's also a sort of, you could probably say, a don't fuck with nature message also, and stuff like not trying to play God and stuff like that, and that also comes through very potently, obviously, especially with the particular outcomes. But there's also like I said, the little things in between. We're talking about a massive picture here, like literally the entire world, but then there's also the whole thing of like their parents and how that goes. And just kind of watching the parents go in this really horrible way, and it also sort of, the way he's confronting that also kind of feels like it goes back to what we were talking about with Riding the Bullet, and confronting that whole thing. That thing kind of makes those similar feelings kind of come back if you're, obviously this, I'm pretty sure, predates Riding the Bullet by quite a bit, but the themes are, you can go back to them and see same feelings. So, and then eventually we get to the point where it just keeps going farther and farther down. And I really love what he did with this as far as the text goes, because obviously when you watch the episode, you can see those terrifying moments when people just kind of start winding down, like the news reporter and stuff like that, where she's just telling the story, and then it just kind of, you can just kind of see it start to take hold of her, and her words start to kind of garble, and then it's almost like she doesn't know where she is. And then the last few shots of it where we see Ron Livingston just kind of succumbing to it while desperately trying to get the rest of the story out. And the way this is described here, or portrayed here, I don't know how well this will show up, but the way the paragraphs and the words just kind of start to fall apart and misspell, and then by the time he gets to the end and signs it, it's just practically illegible. And just reading that is kind of terrifying, how it's like we've seen the whole story from his perspective and through his words and through the first person, and to just watch it like fall apart in real time is really like it makes up for the whole thing of the urgency of the story may not always be there, but that's yeah. So I actually do like the story quite a bit, and I do think it was one of the higher points, along with Battleground, of the miniseries. Which, as we've said, the miniseries is kind of overall was pretty much a bust. That was overwhelming to one side on this doesn't really work to the stuff that ultimately did work. But we've still got 2 episodes left of that, and still a handful of movies to talk about for this series. So until all of those, I think that's pretty much it for